They say the universe has a sense of humor. The Galactic Council certainly thought they were being clever when they decided humanity owed them a debt. After all, we were just another primitive species that had barely crawled out of our gravity well, weren't we? Just another collection of hairless apes playing with fire and calling it civilization. The Council had been collecting protection fees from developing species for millennia. It was a simple arrangement: pay up, or face the consequences. Most species paid willingly, grateful for the Council's benevolent guidance and defensive services against the various threats lurking in the dark corners of space. But humanity? Humanity looked at the bill, looked at the Council's impressive fleet of warships hovering over Earth, looked at the ultimatum demanding 90% of our planet's resources as payment for galactic services rendered, and humanity laughed. That laugh echoed across the stars, carrying with it a promise that the Council would soon understand. They had expected payment in resources, in submission, in the quiet compliance that had served them so well with every other species they'd encountered. Instead, they were about to learn why, in every human language, there exists a phrase that roughly translates to, "You picked the wrong species to mess with." What follows is the story of how the Council learned that when you corner a predator species that has spent its entire evolutionary history turning every disadvantage into a weapon, every setback into a strategy, and every enemy into a cautionary tale, you don't get payment. You get war. And humanity had been preparing for war since the first ape picked up a stick and realized it could be used for more than just reaching fruit. Ambassador Sarah Chen stood at the observation deck of the United Earth Embassy Station, watching the massive alien vessel approach through the swirling nebula that surrounded the neutral meeting zone. The ship was beautiful in its own way, all flowing curves and crystalline surfaces that caught and reflected the distant starlight like a jewel floating through the cosmos. It was also the size of Manhattan and bristling with enough weaponry to crack a moon. The Galactic Council had finally come calling. It had been 3 months since humanity's first contact with the broader galactic community. 3 months since that fateful day when a routine mining operation in the asteroid belt had uncovered a derelict probe containing what appeared to be a universal translator and a message that essentially boiled down to "Hello, primitives. You exist. We know about it now. Report for processing." The discovery had sent shockwaves through every government on Earth. Humanity was not alone in the universe, and, apparently, they were also not particularly welcome. The message had been polite enough, couched in diplomatic language about galactic integration procedures and civilization assessment protocols, but the underlying message was clear: Earth was being summoned to account for itself. Sarah adjusted her collar and checked her tablet one more time. As Earth's first xenobiological ambassador, she carried the weight of representing not just her planet, but her entire species to beings who had been traveling between stars since before humans had discovered agriculture. The pressure was immense, but she had volunteered for this role for the same reason she had spent 15 years studying theoretical xenobiology before first contact had made her field suddenly very practical. She genuinely believed that communication and understanding could bridge any gap, no matter how vast. The docking bay doors hissed open with a sound that seemed to echo through the entire station. Sarah felt her breath catch as the first representatives of the Galactic Council stepped through. They were not what she had expected. The lead figure was tall, perhaps 8 feet in height, with skin that seemed to shift between deep purple and midnight blue depending on the angle of the light. Its features were angular, almost crystalline, with 4 eyes arranged in a diamond pattern on what she assumed was its face. When it moved, it did so with a fluid grace that reminded Sarah of a dancer, each gesture precise and intentional. Behind the first figure came 2 more beings, these shorter and stockier, with what appeared to be chitinous exoskeletons and multiple arms that moved in complex, coordinated patterns. Their faces were hidden behind elaborate masks that Sarah suspected might actually be breathing apparatus rather than decoration. "I am Hierarchal Vex of the Third Spiral Council," the tall figure spoke, its voice emerging from a device that floated near its shoulder rather than from what Sarah assumed might be its mouth. The translation was flawless, rendering the alien sounds into crisp, formal English. "I am here to conduct the standard civilization assessment of the species designated as human and to establish the appropriate tribute schedule for continued protection and galactic citizenship." Sarah stepped forward, offering what she hoped was a diplomatically appropriate bow. "I am Ambassador Sarah Chen, representing the United Earth Government. We welcome you to our space and look forward to learning about the greater galactic community." Hierarchal Vex, 4 eyes fixed on her with what she interpreted as mild interest. Your eagerness is noted, human Chen. However, this is not a negotiation or a learning opportunity. This is an assessment and billing procedure. Your species has achieved faster than light travel and has begun expanding beyond your home system. According to Galactic Council Regulation 47 Alpha, this constitutes entry into the galactic community and triggers automatic enrollment in the Galactic Protection and Guidance Program. I'm sorry, Sarah said carefully, but could you explain what this program entails? We weren't aware that there were any fees or obligations associated with space travel. One of the chitinous beings behind Vex made a sound that the translator rendered as laughter, though it sounded more like grinding metal. Ignorance is not an excuse, human. Every species that ventures beyond its home system falls under Council protection. The galaxy is a dangerous place. There are pirates, hostile species, rogue AI networks, and countless other threats that a primitive species like yours could never hope to face alone. We appreciate the concern, Sarah replied, but humanity has always been capable of defending itself. We're certainly interested in learning about these threats and, perhaps cooperating on mutual defense, but we're not sure we need protection services. Vex's skin shifted to a deeper shade of purple. This is not optional, human Chen. Your species now owes the Council compensation for the protection services that we have already begun providing. Our fleet monitors your space, our intelligence networks track potential threats to your system, and our diplomatic corps has already begun the process of establishing your species' place in the galactic hierarchy. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. And what would this compensation entail? 90% of your planetary output for the next 50 standard years, Vex stated matter-of-factly. This includes raw materials, manufactured goods, food production, and population contributions to Council workforces. In return, you will receive continued protection, access to basic galactic technologies, and the privilege of citizenship in our great community. The translator device somehow managed to convey Vex's tone of voice, and Sarah realized with growing horror that the alien wasn't making threats or trying to intimidate her. From its perspective, this was simply how things worked. This was a business transaction. I'm afraid that's completely impossible, Sarah said, working to keep her voice steady. What you're describing would essentially strip our planet bare and leave our population destitute. Surely there must be some alternative arrangement we could make? The chitinous being that had laughed earlier stepped forward. I am Subcoordinator Clack of the Resource Assessment Division. The terms are non-negotiable, human. Every species in the galaxy has accepted these arrangements. Your refusal would be unprecedented. Then, perhaps it's time for a precedent, Sarah replied, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. Humanity is willing to participate in the galactic community as equals, but we will not accept subjugation disguised as protection. Vex's 4 eyes widened in what Sarah interpreted as genuine surprise. You misunderstand the nature of your position, human Chen. You are not equals. Your species has existed for perhaps 200,000 years. You have had spaceflight for less than 100 of your years. You have possessed nuclear weapons for fewer than 100 years and have nearly destroyed yourselves with them multiple times. You are children playing with tools you barely understand. And yet, Sarah said, feeling a strange surge of pride, we're here. We survived every challenge our world threw at us. We learned from our mistakes. We grew beyond our limitations. We reached for the stars and found them. Perhaps experience isn't the only measure of capability. Your sentiment is admirable but irrelevant, Subcoordinator Clack interjected. The assessment has been completed. Your species possesses approximately 12 billion individuals, limited industrial capacity, a single inhabited world, and minimal space-based infrastructure. You have no significant allies, no advanced technology beyond basic FTL drives, and no military capability that would pose even a minor threat to Council security. The protection fee has been calculated accordingly. Sarah looked between the 3 aliens, realizing with growing clarity that this was not the beginning of a diplomatic relationship. This was a shakedown, pure and simple. The Council had found another species to exploit, and they had become so comfortable with their power that they couldn't even imagine resistance. I need to discuss this with my government, she said finally. Of course, Vex replied smoothly. You have one standard galactic month to arrange the first payment. Our enforcement fleet will arrive to collect the tribute and establish permanent oversight stations in your system at that time. This has been a most satisfactory assessment. The three aliens turned to leave, but Vex paused at the docking bay entrance and looked back at Sarah. Human Shan, I feel compelled to mention that in the 17,000 years that the Council has conducted these assessments, no species has ever refused our terms. I hope your leadership will consider this precedent when making their decision. As the alien ship departed, Sarah stood alone in the observation deck, watching its crystalline hull disappear into the swirling nebula. The implications of the encounter were staggering. Humanity had just been presented with a choice: surrender their independence and become vassals to an alien empire, or find themselves at war with a force that claimed dominion over the entire galaxy. She activated her communication array and opened a priority channel to Earth. Within moments, the face of Secretary General Martinez appeared on her screen, his expression tense with concern. Ambassador Chen, what's your assessment? Sarah took a deep breath. Mr. Secretary General, they're not here to establish diplomatic relations. They're here to collect tribute. They want 90% of everything we produce for the next 50 years, and they're treating it like it's a routine business transaction. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. And if we refuse? They didn't say explicitly, but they made it clear that refusal has never happened before. I got the impression that they're not entirely sure what they would do if we said no. Interesting, Martinez murmured. What's your read on their capabilities? Technologically superior, certainly. But, Mr. Secretary General, there was something about their attitude that struck me. They become so accustomed to species simply rolling over and accepting these terms that they can't even conceive of real resistance. They're bureaucrats, not warriors. Are you suggesting we refuse their demands? Sarah looked out at the stars, thinking about everything humanity had accomplished despite every obstacle the universe had thrown at them. Ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plagues, wars, famines, and countless other disasters that should have wiped them out. Yet here they were, reaching for the stars and finding themselves face to face with an empire that wanted to clip their wings before they had even learned to truly fly. I'm suggesting, Mr. Secretary General, that they may have made a fundamental miscalculation about what kind of species they're dealing with. They see us as primitive children playing with dangerous toys. But what they don't understand is that dangerous toys are exactly what we specialize in. Martinez nodded slowly. I'll convene an emergency session of the Global Security Council. How long do we have? 1 month until their enforcement fleet arrives. Then, we'd better get to work. Sarah, I want you to stay in the neutral zone and gather as much intelligence as possible about Council capabilities and operations. If we're going to do this, we need to know exactly what we're up against. As the communication ended, Sarah settled in for what she knew would be the longest month in human history. In the distance, she could see the running lights of other alien vessels moving through the nebula, and she wondered how many of them belonged to species that had simply accepted the Council's terms without question. Humanity was about to find out if they were truly alone in their defiance, or if they might discover allies among the stars who had simply been waiting for someone to throw the first stone. One way or another, the galaxy was about to learn that Earth's children had grown up fighting for every inch of ground they had ever gained, and they had no intention of giving it up now. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, in a bunker that had once been designed to house the leadership of the United States during a nuclear war, the representatives of every major nation on Earth sat around a circular table that seemed impossibly small for the weight of the decisions it would bear. General Patricia Hayes, the newly appointed Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Forces, stood at the head of the table with a holographic display showing the Council's estimated fleet strength floating behind her. The numbers were not encouraging. Based on Ambassador Chen's intelligence and our analysis of the probe data, we're looking at a minimum force of 300 capital ships, each one comparable in size to our largest space stations, she began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was describing. Their technology appears to be at least 2 centuries ahead of ours in most areas. They have energy shields, directed energy weapons, and what our physicists believe might be some form of gravity manipulation technology. Dr. Yuki Tanaka, Japan's representative and one of Earth's leading theoretical physicists, raised her hand. General, with all due respect, those numbers assume we're fighting a conventional battle. Has anyone considered that we might not have to? Explain, said President Elizabeth Warren of the North American Federation, leaning forward with interest. Dr. Tanaka stood and activated her own holographic display, showing a complex network of energy patterns. The Council has been doing this for thousands of years. They've developed a system that works perfectly against every species they've encountered. But that system has a fundamental weakness: it's become predictable. Go on, General Hayes urged. Every species they've subjugated has followed the same pattern. They achieve FTL travel, get discovered by the Council, receive the assessment, and then either submit immediately or offer token resistance before submitting. The Council has built their entire military doctrine around overwhelming force designed to discourage resistance, not to fight a prolonged war. Premier Zhang Wei of the Chinese Democratic Republic nodded thoughtfully. You're suggesting they're not actually prepared for a real fight. I'm suggesting they're prepared for the kind of fight they expect, Dr. Tanaka clarified. A few skirmishes, maybe some attempted raids on their ships, followed by inevitable surrender when the target species realizes the hopelessness of their position. But what if we don't follow that pattern? Admiral Sarah Okafor of the African Union Space Command spoke up from her position across the table. The problem is still the technology gap. Even if their tactics are predictable, their ships can still blow ours apart without breaking a sweat. Can they? Asked Dr. Rajesh Patel, Earth's leading expert in xenobiology and the man who had spent the last 3 months analyzing every scrap of data they had about Council physiology. We've been assuming that their technological superiority translates to tactical superiority, but what if that's not the case? He activated his own display, showing anatomical charts of the 3 species they had encountered. Look at these beings. The hierarchical species appears to have evolved from creatures that lived in low-gravity environments with minimal physical threats. Their entire physiology is optimized for grace and precision, not for stress or rapid adaptation. The chitinous species shows signs of having evolved in a highly regulated environment with abundant resources. Neither of them shows evolutionary markers for dealing with the kind of chaotic, high-stress situations that human warfare tends to create. What are you getting at, Doctor? General Hayes asked. I'm suggesting that while they have better technology, they may not have better soldiers. In fact, based on their evolutionary history, they may be psychologically incapable of the kind of adaptive, chaotic warfare that humans excel at. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Finally, President Chen Okafor of the European Federation spoke. Are you suggesting we could actually win a war against them? I'm suggesting, Dr. Patel replied carefully, that we might be able to fight a kind of war they're not prepared for. General Hayes activated a new display showing Earth's current military assets. Our space-based forces are limited. We have 47 operational warships, 12 space stations with defensive capabilities, and approximately 200 smaller vessels that could be retrofitted for combat. Against their 300 capital ships, it's not much. Unless we don't fight the battle they're expecting, said Colonel Maria Santos, the representative from the South American Alliance. General, what if we treated this like an asymmetric warfare scenario? The general's eyes lit up with understanding. Guerrilla tactics. Hit and run. Force them to fight on our terms instead of theirs. Exactly, Colonel Santos continued. The Council controls vast territories across multiple star systems. Their supply lines must be enormous. Their communication networks must be incredibly complex. And they've probably never had to deal with an enemy that actively tried to disrupt those systems rather than just throwing ships at their fleets. Admiral Okafor leaned back in her chair, a slow smile spreading across her face. We're not talking about defeating their military. We're talking about making their system of control unworkable. Dr. Tanaka nodded enthusiastically. Think about it from their perspective. They've built an empire based on the principle that overwhelming force applied at the right moment will prevent any serious resistance. But what if resistance doesn't come in the form they expect? What if instead of trying to match their fleet in open battle, we make it impossible for them to maintain control over their territory? President Warren stood and began pacing around the table. This is all theoretical unless we can actually build the capabilities you're talking about. Our shipyards are already working at maximum capacity just to maintain what we have. Ma'am, said Minister Ada Orikomu of the Southern African Development Community, perhaps we're thinking about this backwards. Instead of trying to build more ships, what if we focused on building different ships? She activated her own display, showing schematics that looked like nothing the others had ever seen. Our engineers have been working on these designs since the first contact. Small, fast vessels designed for stealth and infiltration rather than direct combat. Ships that can slip past their sensors, deliver targeted strikes, and disappear before they can respond. General Hayes studied the schematics with professional interest. These are tiny. No more than 10 crew members each. What kind of damage could they possibly do? It's not about the damage each individual ship can do, Minister Komu explained. It's about the cumulative effect of hundreds of these vessels operating independently across their entire territory. Imagine trying to maintain control of an empire when supply convoys start disappearing, communication relays get sabotaged, and your peacekeeping forces are constantly being harassed by enemies they can't catch. Dr. Patel pulled up another display showing what appeared to be psychological profiles. Based on our analysis of council behavior patterns, they appear to be a highly hierarchical society that values order and predictability above all else. Chaos and uncertainty are probably their worst nightmares. So we give them their worst nightmare, General Hayes said with grim satisfaction. The discussion continued for hours, with each representative contributing ideas and expertise from their respective regions. Gradually, a picture began to emerge of a war unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Not a clash of fleets in the deep void, but a systematic campaign of disruption designed to make the Council's empire too expensive to maintain. President Warren finally called for order. Ladies and gentlemen, we're talking about declaring war on an empire that spans thousands of star systems and commands resources we can barely imagine. Before we go any further, I need to know, are we all in agreement that this is the path we want to take? The room fell silent again. Each representative understood that they were being asked to speak not just for their governments, but for their entire populations. The decision they made here would affect every human being alive, and potentially every human being who would ever be born. Premier Zhang spoke first. China has spent centuries learning that sometimes the only way to maintain independence is to fight for it, regardless of the odds. President Chen Okafor nodded. Europe agrees. We've seen what happens when peoples are forced to accept subjugation in the name of peace. Admiral Okafor's voice was quiet but firm. Africa has experience with exploitation disguised as protection. We will not accept it again. One by one, each representative voiced their agreement. When the vote was finally taken, it was unanimous. General Hayes stood and looked around the table at the faces of the people who had just committed their species to what might be the most desperate war in human history. Then, we're really doing this. We're going to war with the Galactic Council. General, President Warren said, how long do we have to prepare? 3 weeks until the Council Enforcement Fleet arrives at Earth, Hayes replied. But, we're not going to be here when they arrive. Explain. If we're going to fight an asymmetric war, we need to start acting asymmetrically immediately. The Council expects to find a cowed population waiting for their protection. Instead, they're going to find empty cities and a message telling them exactly where they can stick their protection services. Dr. Tanaka looked puzzled. You're talking about evacuating Earth? Not evacuating, General Hayes clarified. Relocating. We've been building hidden bases throughout the outer system for the past 3 months. The moment the Council fleet enters Earth space, they'll find a planet that's been systematically emptied of everything valuable, including its population. And then, asked Colonel Santos. General Hayes smiled, and there was something predatory in her expression that would have been very familiar to any student of human history. And then, we show them why every predator species in Earth's evolutionary history eventually learned not to back humans into a corner. The meeting continued through the night, with detailed plans being drawn up for what would later be known as the Great Relocation. As dawn broke over the mountains above their hidden bunker, the representatives of humanity finalized their preparations for a war that would reshape the galaxy. None of them slept well that night, but it wasn't because of fear. It was because they were all thinking the same thought. The council had made the classic mistake of every bully throughout human history. They had assumed that because they were bigger and stronger, they were also smarter and more determined. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Hierarchal Vex stood on the command bridge of the Council Enforcement Dreadnought Eternal Order, watching the blue-green marble of the human homeworld grow larger in the viewscreen. The fleet had arrived exactly on schedule, precisely 1 galactic standard month after the assessment had been completed. 300 ships of the line, enough firepower to sterilize a planet's surface or crack its crust, all arranged in the traditional enforcement formation that had cowed 1,000 species into submission. Everything was proceeding according to established protocols, except for one disturbing detail: the humans weren't responding to their communications. Subcoordinator Clack, Vex said, its skin shifting to a slightly darker shade of purple that indicated mild concern. "What is the status of our communication attempts?" The chitin is being manipulated several controls with its multiple arms, producing a series of clicking sounds that the translation matrix rendered as frustrated mumbling. "We have sent the standard tribute collection notification on all known human communication frequencies. We have also broadcasted the mandatory submission demand in 17 different human languages. There has been no response from the planetary government or any space-based installations. Perhaps they require a demonstration of our capabilities," suggested Fleet Commander Zorith, a tall, spindly creature whose species had evolved from some form of aquatic plant. Its voice carried the wet, rustling quality of leaves in a gentle current. It would not be the first time a newly contacted species required additional persuasion. Vex considered this. In its long experience with tribute collection, some species did indeed require a show of force before they understood the futility of resistance. Usually, a few precisely targeted strikes on uninhabited areas were sufficient to demonstrate the Council's technological superiority. "Very well. Commander Zorith, select an uninhabited landmass and deploy a Class 3 demonstration strike. Ensure that the energy signature is visible from their major population centers." At once, Hierarchal. The fleet's sensors had identified the human homeworld's major population centers during their approach. Massive urban sprawls containing millions of individuals, industrial complexes that stretched across entire continents, and transportation networks that connected every corner of the planet. It was a typical pattern for a species at humanity's level of development. The demonstration strike lanced out from the fleet's lead ships, a brilliant beam of coherent energy that could have carved through the hull of a battleship like a knife through paper. It struck an uninhabited mountain range on the planet's largest continent, vaporizing several peaks and creating a crater visible from orbit. The human response was immediate and completely unexpected. Hierarchal, Subcoordinator Clack announced, its translator struggling to convey what might have been confusion or alarm. "We are receiving a transmission from the planet's surface." "Excellent. Display it immediately." The main viewscreen shifted to show a single human figure standing in what appeared to be an empty field. The individual was wearing some form of military uniform and stood with the relaxed confidence of someone who was not at all intimidated by the massive alien fleet hovering over their world. "Greetings, Galactic Council," the human said, its voice carrying clearly through the translation matrix. "I am General Patricia Hayes, Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Forces. Thank you for the fireworks display. It was quite impressive." Vex felt a ripple of confusion run through its consciousness. The human seemed almost amused. This was not the usual reaction to a demonstration of Council firepower. "Human Hayes," Vex responded, activating the fleet's communications array, "you have witnessed but a fraction of our capabilities. The time for tribute collection has arrived. You will immediately begin transferring the agreed-upon resources to our collection vessels." The human actually smiled. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding, Hierarchal Vex. There was no agreement. There was an ultimatum delivered by your people, and a decision made by mine. Would you like to hear our decision?" "Proceed." "We decline your generous offer of protection services. We also decline your request for tribute. In fact, we formally reject the authority of the Galactic Council to govern the actions of humanity." Earth hereby declares its independence from any and all galactic governmental bodies that humanity did not consent to join. The silence on the bridge was absolute. In 17,000 years of Council operations, no species had ever formally declared independence from galactic authority. The concept was so alien that Vex's translation matrix actually struggled to process the words. You decline? Vex finally managed. That's correct. We've also taken the liberty of relocating our population and industrial capacity to secure locations throughout our system. What you're looking at down there is essentially an empty planet. Beautiful view, but not much in the way of tribute potential. Subcoordinator Clack worked frantically at its control station. Hierarchical, deep scans confirmed the human statement. Planetary population reading is less than 1% of previous estimates. Industrial centers show minimal activity. It appears they have evacuated their entire civilization. Fleet Commander Zoreth moved closer to the main display, its aquatic features somehow managing to convey astonishment. This is unprecedented. No species has ever attempted to relocate their entire population to avoid tribute collection. General Hayes seemed to be enjoying their confusion. Well, humans have a saying, there's a first time for everything. Now, since you've made the trip all the way out here, let me save you some time. You're not getting your tribute. You're not going to establish oversight stations in our system. And, if you attempt to use force to compel our compliance, you're going to discover that we're a lot more dangerous than your assessment suggested. Vex's skin shifted to a deep shade of red that indicated genuine anger. Human Hayes, you appear to be under the mistaken impression that you have choices in this matter. Your species has achieved faster-than-light capability and has entered galactic space. This automatically places you under Council jurisdiction. Your compliance is not optional. Actually, it is optional, Hayes replied calmly. In fact, it's so optional that we've decided to exercise a different option entirely. As of this moment, humanity is at war with the Galactic Council. The declaration hit the bridge crew like a physical blow. War? No newly contacted species had ever declared war on the Council. The very idea was absurd. It was like a single insect declaring war on an entire ecosystem. You cannot be serious, Vex said, its voice carrying a note of genuine disbelief. Dead serious, Hayes confirmed. Hierarchical, your council has spent thousands of years building an empire based on exploitation and intimidation. You've grown comfortable with the idea that might makes right, and that superior technology automatically grants you the authority to dictate terms to anyone you encounter. Today, that ends. Human Hayes, Fleet Commander Zoreth interjected, you cannot possibly comprehend the scope of what you are suggesting. The Council commands the resources of 12,000 star systems. Our fleet's number in the millions of vessels. Our technology is millennia ahead of yours. This is not a war you can win. Commander Zoreth, you're absolutely right. This isn't a war we can win using your rules. Fortunately, we don't plan to play by your rules. Hayes gestured to something off camera, and the transmission's background shifted to show what appeared to be a massive underground facility filled with activity. Humanity has been preparing for this conversation for the past month. We've relocated our population, secured our industrial capacity, and positioned our forces throughout the system. More importantly, we've studied your empire and identified its weaknesses. Our empire has no weaknesses, Vex declared, though its skin color suggested less certainty than its words conveyed. Every empire has weaknesses, hierarchical. Yours just happen to be structural. You've built a system of control that depends on predictable responses from subjugated populations. You've designed your military doctrine around overwhelming force applied against static targets. And you've grown so accustomed to compliance that you've forgotten how to fight an enemy that doesn't want to hold territory or protect fixed assets. Subcoordinator Clack looked up from its control station. Hierarchical, I am detecting multiple small objects emerging from concealed positions throughout the system. They appear to be vessels of some kind, but they are too small to register as significant threats. Hayes smiled again, and Vex was beginning to realize that human facial expressions could be quite unsettling when they carried certain emotional overtones. Those would be the opening moves in what we like to call asymmetric warfare. Commander Zoreth, Fleet Commander, in a few moments you're going to start receiving reports of problems throughout your empire. Supply convoys going missing. Communication relays being sabotaged. Patrol ships disappearing without a trace. At first, it'll seem like isolated incidents. Random pirate attacks, perhaps, or equipment failures. What are you saying? Fleet Commander Zoreth demanded. I'm saying that while you've been traveling here to collect your tribute, we've been busy. Humanity has a lot of experience with guerrilla warfare, and we've spent the past month putting that experience to work throughout your territory. We've identified your major supply routes, mapped your communication networks, and located your most vulnerable installations. What you're about to experience is a systematic campaign designed to make your empire too expensive to maintain. Vex felt something it had not experienced in centuries: genuine uncertainty. You have deployed forces throughout Council territory? How is that possible? Small ships, volunteer crews, and very good intelligence. It turns out that when you control thousands of star systems, you can't watch all of them all the time. And, when you've grown comfortable with the idea that no one would dare challenge you, you become surprisingly vulnerable to people who are willing to do exactly that. As if summoned by Hayes' words, alerts began sounding throughout the bridge of the Eternal Order. Subcoordinator Clack's multiple arms moved frantically across its control surfaces as reports flooded in from across the Council's territory. Hierarchical, emergency transmission from Sector 7 Alpha. A supply convoy bound for the Rigel system has failed to report in. Last communication indicated they were under attack by unknown vessels. Another message from the Vega mining operation. They report that their communication relay has been destroyed by what they describe as impossibly small and fast ships. Priority alert from the Arcturus garrison. They are requesting immediate reinforcement. They claim to be under sustained attack by. I am sorry, Hierarchical, but this cannot be correct. They claim to be under attack by a single small vessel that appears and disappears before their sensors can lock onto it. The reports continue to pour in, each one describing incidents that should have been impossible. How could a species that had possessed FTL travel for less than a century have deployed forces across the galaxy? How could ships small enough to avoid detection carry sufficient firepower to threaten Council installations? General Hayes watched their confusion with what Vex was beginning to recognize as a distinctly predatory satisfaction. Hierarchical, you made the same mistake that every bully in human history has made. You assumed that because you were bigger and stronger, you were also smarter and more adaptable. You built your empire on the assumption that superior technology would always triumph over superior strategy. This is impossible, Vex declared, though its skin color was cycling rapidly through shades that indicated severe stress. Your species lacks the resources for operations of this scope. Actually, we don't. See, the thing about humans is that when we put our minds to something, we tend to be very thorough. We've been building and positioning assets throughout your territory for weeks. Small vessels, yes, but carrying very powerful weapons and operated by volunteers who understand that they're probably not coming home. Fleet Commander Zoreth moved closer to the communication display. You are describing a suicide mission. I'm describing a war, Commander. And, in war, some people make sacrifices so that others can be free. It's a concept that your species might not understand, having apparently never had to fight for your independence. More alerts continued to sound as the scope of the human operation became clear. They had somehow managed to deploy hundreds of small vessels throughout Council territory, each one conducting independent operations against targets that had been considered completely secure. The attacks weren't designed to cause maximum damage, they were designed to cause maximum disruption. Hierarchical, Subcoordinator Clack announced, its voice carrying what the translator rendered as panic. I am receiving reports from 17 different sectors. Communication networks are being systematically targeted. Supply routes are under constant harassment. Several garrison commanders are requesting permission to abandon their positions. Vex stared at the transmission from General Hayes, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. In the space of a single day, the Council's empire was beginning to experience problems on a scale that had not been seen in millennia. Not because of a massive military assault, but because of a coordinated campaign of harassment and sabotage that targeted the very systems that kept their empire functioning. Human Haze, Vex said finally, you cannot possibly maintain operations of this scope indefinitely. Your forces are small and scattered. Our response will be overwhelming once we organize our defenses. Maybe, Haze agreed. But that assumes you can organize an effective response while dealing with the chaos we're creating. It also assumes that we plan to maintain a static level of operations. Actually, what you're experiencing right now is just the beginning. Every day that passes, more human vessels will enter your territory. Every successful operation will be followed by 3 more. Every installation you lose will be replaced by a vulnerability you didn't know you had. You are describing a war of attrition that you cannot possibly win. I'm describing a war of attrition that you cannot possibly afford to fight. Hierarchal, your empire controls 12,000 star systems, but that's also your greatest weakness. You have to defend everything. We don't have to defend anything. You need your supply lines, your communication networks, your garrison forces. We just need to break them. As if to emphasize her point, another wave of emergency transmissions flooded the bridge. Mining operations under attack. Patrol vessels missing. Administrative centers reporting complete communication blackouts. Vex realized, with a growing sense of something that might have been fear, that the humans had not just declared war on the Council. They had already been fighting that war for days, possibly weeks, while the Council's attention was focused on the tribute collection at Earth. What do you want? Vex asked, and immediately regretted the words. To ask that question was to acknowledge that the humans had something the Council needed. General Hayes' smile widened. That's the first intelligent question you've asked, Hierarchal. What we want is very simple, we want to be left alone. We want the Council to formally recognize humanity's independence and sovereignty over our star system. We want you to take your fleet and go home. And we want you to never come back. And if we refuse? Hayes' expression grew serious. Then, this continues until your empire collapses under the weight of trying to maintain control over territories you can't actually protect. How long do you think your member species will remain loyal when they realize that the Council can't even keep their supply routes open? The question hung in the air like a knife. Around the bridge, the Council representatives looked at each other with expressions that conveyed the same growing realization: they were not just dealing with a rebellious species. They were dealing with a fundamental threat to the entire system that had kept their empire stable for millennia. If the humans could successfully resist Council authority, what would prevent other species from trying the same thing? And if other species began to resist, how could the Council possibly maintain control over an empire that spanned thousands of star systems? General Hayes seemed to read their thoughts. Hierarchal, you have a choice to make. You can cut your losses, recognize our independence, and go home to deal with the problems we've already created. Or you can try to force our compliance and watch your empire tear itself apart while you're distracted by a war you can't win. This conversation is not over, Human Haze. No, it isn't. But it's no longer taking place on Earth. This is humanity's territory now, and you're no longer welcome here. You have 24 hours to remove your fleet from our space. After that, we start shooting. The transmission ended, leaving the bridge of the Eternal Order in stunned silence. Somewhere in the distance, more alerts were sounding as reports continued to pour in from across the Council's territory. Hierarchal Vex stared at the empty viewscreen where General Hayes had been, trying to process the fact that everything had just changed. The Council had come to collect tribute from a primitive species, and instead they had found themselves at war with an enemy they didn't understand and couldn't predict. Worse still, they were losing. 6 months after the first shots were fired, the Grand Council chamber on Nexus Prime had become a place of barely controlled chaos. Representatives from 12,000 star systems filled the vast amphitheater, their voices combining into a cacophony of complaints, demands, and increasingly desperate pleas for action. Supreme Hierarchal Zeth stood at the central podium, its ancient form trembling with a combination of age and rage that its species' equivalent of adrenaline could no longer adequately support. For 30,000 years, the Council had maintained order through a simple formula: overwhelming force applied at the moment of resistance, followed by swift incorporation of new species into the galactic hierarchy. It had worked without fail through countless first contacts, territorial disputes, and the occasional rebellion. Until now. Order! Zeth's voice, amplified by the chamber's acoustic systems, cut through the noise like a blade. We will have order in this chamber. The din gradually subsided, though the tension in the air remained thick enough to cut with a vibroblade. Zeth's four eyes swept across the assembled representatives, noting the expressions of fear, anger, and growing desperation that had become all too common in recent months. We are here to address the situation that has developed in the outer spiral territories, Zeth continued, choosing its words carefully. Even now, 6 months into what the humans called their independence war, many council members refused to acknowledge the true scope of what they were facing. Representative Orcs of the Vegan Trade Consortium stood from its designated speaking position, its translucent blue form flickering with the emotional patterns that served as its species' primary form of expression. Supreme Hierarchal, with respect, this is no longer a situation. This is a catastrophe. My consortium has lost 47 merchant vessels in the past month alone. Our insurance carriers are refusing to provide coverage for any shipments beyond the inner core systems. The vegans are correct, added Counselor Thren of the Andromedan Mining Guild, its crystalline form resonating with harmonic frequencies that the translation matrix rendered as bitter frustration. Our extraction operations in sectors 12 through 18 have become completely untenable. These human raiders appear without warning, strike with precision that defies our sensor networks, and vanish before our security forces can respond. Zeth felt the familiar weight of leadership settling on its shoulders like a burial shroud. The reports had been coming in for months, each one describing the same impossible pattern. Small human vessels, operating independently or in tiny groups, systematically attacking the infrastructure that held the Council's empire together. Not the spectacular fleet engagements that galactic warfare doctrine had prepared for, but a relentless campaign of harassment that was slowly bleeding their civilization to death. The Enforcement Division has deployed additional patrol fleets to the affected regions, Zeth announced, though it knew the response would be inadequate even as the words left its vocal apparatus. Additional patrol fleets? Representative Vox of the Rigel Defense Authority stood abruptly, its insectoid form clicking with agitation. Supreme Hierarchal, we have deployed 60% of our total military capacity to hunt these human raiders, and our effectiveness rating remains below 12%. They are fighting a form of warfare that our tactical doctrine cannot address. The truth of that statement hung in the chamber like a toxic cloud. The Council's military had been designed for a specific type of conflict, massive fleet engagements between comparable forces, followed by occupation and pacification of defeated territories. It was a doctrine that had served them well for millennia, but it assumed that their enemies would fight the same kind of war. The humans weren't playing by those rules. Perhaps, Counselor Yeth of the Inner Spiral Banking Federation suggested tentatively, we should consider negotiations? The silence that followed was deafening. To suggest negotiations was to acknowledge that the humans were a legitimate political entity rather than rebellious subjects. It was to admit that the Council's authority was not absolute. Negotiations? Zeth's voice carried a note of disbelief. With pirates and terrorists? With an enemy that is systematically dismantling our empire, Yeth replied firmly. Supreme Hierarchal, the economic data is unambiguous. If these attacks continue at their current rate, our trade networks will collapse within 2 years. Several outer system governments have already begun questioning whether Council protection is worth the tribute they pay for it. That was the nightmare scenario that kept every Council member awake during their rest cycles. The humans weren't just attacking Council infrastructure, they were undermining the fundamental premise that justified the Council's existence. For 12,000 years, species had paid tribute in exchange for protection and stability. But, what happened when the Council could no longer provide either? Hierarchal Vax, who had been silent since returning from the disastrous Earth expedition, finally stood to address the chamber. Its skin had maintained a sickly yellow color ever since its encounter with General Hayes, a sign of chronic stress among its species. Fellow Council members, Vex began, its voice carrying a weariness that seemed to age its translator's voice synthesis. I believe we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of what we are facing. Explain, Zeth commanded. We have been treating this as a military rebellion that can be suppressed through the application of superior force. But, this is not a rebellion in any sense that our doctrine recognizes. This is a war of liberation being fought by a species that has no intention of conquering territory or establishing governmental control over our systems. Vex activated a holographic display that showed the pattern of human attacks across Council space. Rather than the concentrated assaults on major population centers that traditional warfare doctrine would predict, the attacks were scattered across thousands of systems, targeting infrastructure and logistics with surgical precision. They do not want our territory, Vex continued. They do not want to rule our people. They want to make our empire so expensive to maintain that we will voluntarily abandon it. And they are succeeding. Representative Corex's form flickered with patterns that indicated deep concern. Are you suggesting that we cannot win this conflict? I am suggesting that we have already lost it, Vex replied. Not in any single battle, but through the cumulative effect of 6 months of systematic infrastructure degradation. Our response time to crisis events has increased by 300%. Our shipping costs have increased by 800%. Our military is exhausted from chasing enemies they cannot catch, and our member species are beginning to question whether the benefits of Council membership justify the costs. Around the chamber, representatives exchanged glances that conveyed a growing sense of panic. If Vex was correct, then, the humans had accomplished something that no enemy in Council history had ever managed. They had made the Council's empire too expensive to operate. What do you propose? Zeth asked, though it suspected it already knew the answer. We negotiate, Vex said simply. We formally recognize human independence, withdraw all Council forces from their territory, and implement immediate defensive reforms to prevent other species from attempting similar resistance campaigns. The chamber erupted in protests and denials, but Zeth noted that the objections were growing weaker and less coordinated than they had been even a month ago. The representatives were exhausted, their economies were bleeding resources, and their military forces were stretched beyond sustainable limits. The humans have demonstrated that our empire has fundamental vulnerabilities, Vex continued once the noise died down. If we do not address those vulnerabilities, other species will inevitably attempt to exploit them. Counselor Thren's crystalline form produced a low harmonic that the translators rendered as sardonic laughter. Other species? Hierarchal Vex, we are already receiving reports of mysterious raids in 17 other sectors that show tactical signatures similar to human operations. Either the humans have expanded their activities beyond anything we previously estimated, or other species are already learning from their example. The implications of that statement struck the chamber like a physical blow. If other species were adopting human tactics, then, the Independence War was no longer a localized conflict. It was the beginning of a galaxy-wide revolution against Council authority. Supreme Hierarchal Zeth felt the weight of 30,000 years of galactic civilization pressing down on its consciousness. The empire that its ancestors had built, that had brought order and stability to countless worlds, was beginning to crumble not because of military defeat, but because of economic impossibility. Contact the humans, Zeth said finally, its voice barely above a whisper. Arrange negotiations. Supreme Hierarchal Representative Vox protested, to negotiate with rebels is to legitimize their resistance. Other species will see that the Council recognizes political realities, Zeth interrupted. The alternative is to continue bleeding resources and personnel in a conflict that we cannot win through conventional means while watching our empire dissolve around us. As the chamber buzzed with shocked conversations, Zeth privately wondered if the Council would survive the precedent they were about to set. To negotiate with the humans was to acknowledge that Council authority could be successfully challenged. Once that acknowledgement was made, how long would it be before other species began testing the limits of that authority? The answer, as events would later prove, was approximately 17 days. The cascade began in the Altair system, where a species known as the Zephyrians had been paying tribute to the Council for over 3,000 years. Unlike many Council subjects, the Zephyrians had maintained a sophisticated industrial base and a strong cultural identity despite centuries of exploitation. When news of the human resistance began spreading through black market communication networks, Zephyrian independence groups began studying human tactics with intense interest. The first Zephyrian attacks were clumsy copies of human operations, but they demonstrated something that sent panic through council leadership. The humans had proven that resistance was possible, and other species were willing to try. Within weeks, similar incidents were being reported throughout the outer spiral territories. Species that had been considered completely pacified were suddenly demonstrating the same kind of small-scale, high-impact resistance that had made the human campaign so devastatingly effective. The council found itself fighting a dozen different independence movements simultaneously, each one learning from human successes and adapting human tactics to their own capabilities. The empire that had taken 30,000 years to build was beginning to fracture along lines that no one had anticipated. By the time council negotiators finally met with human representatives, the independence war had become something much larger than a single species rebellion. It had become the catalyst for a galaxy-wide revolution that would reshape the fundamental nature of interstellar politics. General Hayes, now bearing the title of Secretary General of the Independent Human Republic, stood in the observation lounge of the negotiation station and watched council ships arrive for what everyone understood would be surrender talks disguised as peace negotiations. Feeling satisfied, asked Admiral Okafor, joining her at the observation window. Hayes considered the question seriously. Satisfied? No. We've accomplished what we set out to do, but the cost. She gestured toward the display screens showing casualty reports from across the galaxy. We started a war to preserve our independence, but we ended up starting a revolution. Do you regret it? Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching the lights of the alien ships reflecting off the station's hull. I regret that it was necessary. But I don't regret that we did what needed to be done. The Council built their empire on the assumption that superior technology automatically granted them the right to rule. They needed to learn that being bigger and stronger doesn't make you right. And now we find out whether intelligence and cooperation can build something better than what fear and intimidation created. Outside the observation lounge, the Council fleet continued its approach, carrying representatives who would soon learn that the age of galactic empires built on tribute and submission was coming to an end. The humans had taught the galaxy a simple but revolutionary lesson: independence was not something that could be granted or denied by those in power. It was something that could be taken by those brave enough to fight for it. The only question now was what kind of galaxy would emerge from the ashes of the old empire. 5 years after the first shots were fired in what historians would later call the Independence War, Secretary General Patricia Hayes stood before the inaugural assembly of the Galactic Federation of Independent Worlds. The vast conference chamber on New Geneva Station hummed with the voices of representatives from over 300 species, each one speaking languages that had been considered rebellious dialects just half a decade earlier. The transformation had been nothing short of revolutionary. Where the council chamber on Nexus Prime had been designed to emphasize hierarchy and submission, with elevated platforms for senior members and increasingly lower positions for lesser species, the Federation Assembly was built around principles of equality and accessibility. Every representative sat at the same level, with translation and communication systems that gave equal priority to every voice, regardless of the speaker's technological capabilities or political importance. Hayes adjusted her ceremonial uniform, still somewhat uncomfortable with the formal trappings of her new role as the Federation's first elected Secretary General. The irony was not lost on her that a war that had begun with humanity's refusal to submit to galactic authority had ended with her being chosen to help lead a new form of galactic government. Fellow representatives, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's advanced acoustic systems, we gather today not as conquerors or conquered, but as equals who have chosen to work together for mutual benefit rather than submit to domination by superior force. The chamber quieted as representatives from across the galaxy turned their attention to the human who had become the unlikely symbol of their revolution. Hayes could see faces, sensor arrays, and communication nodes from dozens of species she had never encountered during the war, each one representing a world that had chosen independence over submission. 5 years ago, the Galactic Council expected humanity to pay tribute for the privilege of existing in their galaxy, Hayes continued. Instead, we delivered something they had not encountered in 30,000 years: total resistance to their authority. What followed was not just a war for human independence, but a galaxy-wide awakening to the possibility that things could be different. In the observation galleries surrounding the main floor, she could see representatives from what remained of the council. They were here not as conquerors, but as petitioners hoping to find a place in the new galactic order that had emerged from the ashes of their empire. The Council had discovered, much to their horror, that the human tactics that had proven so devastatingly effective were not particularly difficult to learn. Within months of the Independence War's beginning, 17 different species had begun implementing similar resistance campaigns. Within a year, that number had grown to over 50. The cascade had been unstoppable. Species that had been paying tribute for millennia suddenly realized that the Council's power was not as absolute as it appeared. Supply lines that had seemed invulnerable proved to be surprisingly fragile when targeted by small, fast vessels operating from hidden bases. Communication networks that had connected thousands of worlds could be disrupted by coordinated attacks on key relay stations. Most importantly, the economic model that had sustained the Council for 30,000 years simply could not function when subjected to systematic disruption by multiple resistance movements operating simultaneously. The old system was built on a simple premise, Hayes explained to the assembled representatives. That superior technology automatically granted superior authority. That bigger was better, that older was wiser, and that might made right. But technology without wisdom leads to stagnation. Age without growth leads to decay. And might without justice leads to inevitable revolution. She activated a holographic display showing the current political map of the galaxy. Where once there had been a single massive empire colored in Council blue, there was now a complex mosaic of independent systems, allied federations, and cooperative trade networks. Today, we formally established the Galactic Federation of Independent Worlds, an organization built on principles that would have been considered revolutionary just 5 years ago. Voluntary membership. Equality of representation. Mutual defense rather than protection tribute. And, most importantly, the absolute right of every species to determine its own destiny. The applause that followed was not the polite, measured response that had characterized Council proceedings, but a genuine expression of enthusiasm from beings who had never before been asked for their opinion about how their galaxy should be governed. Ambassador Sarah Chen, now serving as the Federation's first Minister of Xenocultural Affairs, stood to address the assembly. Her hair had gone gray during the war years, and there were lines around her eyes that spoke of too many sleepless nights spent negotiating ceasefires and planning refugee relocations. Mr. Secretary General, she said, using the formal address that Federation protocol required, the delegation from the Zephyrian Republic has requested permission to address the Assembly regarding their proposal for the Universal Peace Accords. Hayes nodded. Ambassador Nix of the Zephyrian Republic is recognized. The being that approached the central speaking platform was tall and graceful, with features that seemed to shift subtly in the chamber's lighting. The Zephyrians had been among the first species to adopt human-inspired resistance tactics, and their independence campaign had been particularly effective because of their deep understanding of Council communication protocols. Secretary General Hayes, fellow representatives, Ambassador Nix began, its voice carrying the musical quality that characterized its species' communication patterns. The Zephyrian Republic proposes that this assembly adopt comprehensive peace accords that would establish protocols for resolving disputes between member worlds without resort to the kind of violence that characterized the liberation wars. The proposal made sense, Hayes reflected. The galaxy was still healing from the chaos that had followed the Council's collapse. While most species had achieved independence through the kind of systematic resistance campaigns that humans had pioneered, some conflicts had escalated into more traditional warfare when desperate Council forces had attempted to maintain control through increasingly brutal methods. The Accords would establish mediation procedures, economic sanctions protocols, and, if necessary, limited intervention capabilities to protect member worlds from aggression by non-Federation entities, Nix continued. We propose that the Federation be an organization that actively works for peace, rather than simply existing as an alliance of convenience. The debate that followed continued for hours, with representatives from dozens of worlds offering amendments, suggestions, and concerns about the proposed peace framework. Hayes found herself marveling at the difference between this discussion and the kind of authoritarian pronouncements that had characterized Council governance. Here, every voice mattered. Every concern was addressed. Every world, regardless of its size or technological capabilities, had an equal say in decisions that would affect the entire galaxy. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't efficient in the way that Council authority had been efficient. But it was something that the galaxy had never seen before, a government that derived its authority from the consent of the governed rather than from superior firepower. The question before us, said Representative Korth of the Andromedan Mining Collective, a species that had been among the Council's most valued industrial partners before the revolution, is whether we are creating a new form of government or simply a new form of empire. The question struck to the heart of concerns that had been voiced repeatedly during the Federation's formation process. How could they ensure that their new organization didn't simply replicate the problems that had made the Council so oppressive? Hayes stood to address the concern. Representative Korth raises the fundamental challenge that faces any democratic institution: how do we maintain our principles while still being effective? The answer, I believe, lies in the structures we build and the limits we place on our own power. She activated another holographic display, this one showing the Federation's proposed governmental structure. Unlike the Council's rigid hierarchy, the Federation was designed with multiple centers of power, term limits for elected officials, and constitutional protections for minority rights. The Federation will have no standing military forces beyond those necessary for peacekeeping and defense, Hayes explained. We will have no authority to impose tribute or taxation beyond voluntary contributions. Most importantly, any member world can withdraw from the Federation at any time, for any reason, without penalty. And, if a member world becomes a threat to other members, asked Councillor Vex, speaking for the first time since the Council's formal dissolution. The former hierarchal had requested permission to address the Assembly as a representative of the species that had once ruled the galaxy. Its presence here was both symbolic and practical, symbolic because it represented the peaceful transition from the old order to the new, and practical because the Federation needed the cooperation of former Council species if it was going to succeed. Then, we deal with that threat using the tools of diplomacy, economic pressure, and, if absolutely necessary, collective action by member worlds, Hayes replied. But, we do so through democratic processes, with transparency and accountability, and with the understanding that the use of force is always a last resort. Vex's skin shifted through several color patterns that Hayes had learned to interpret as deep thought. And, you believe this system will be more effective than the stability that the Council provided? I believe it will be more just, Hayes answered. And, in the long run, justice is more stable than oppression. The Council's system worked for 30,000 years, but it worked by suppressing the natural desire of intelligent beings to control their own destinies. Eventually, that suppression was going to create the kind of explosion we experienced during the Liberation Wars. And, if other species choose not to join your federation? If they prefer independence to cooperation? Hayes smiled. Then, they remain independent, and we respect their choice. The Federation exists to serve its members, not to rule over them. If a species prefers solitude, that's their right. If they want to form their own alliances, that's also their right. The only thing we won't tolerate is the kind of imperial expansionism that characterized the Council's approach to governance. The discussion continued well into the station's night cycle, with representatives working through the complex details of how their new government would function. Trade agreements, defense protocols, resource-sharing arrangements, and dozens of other practical considerations that would determine whether the Federation would thrive or collapse under the weight of its own idealism. As the session finally came to an end, Hayes found herself standing once again at an observation window, looking out at the stars and thinking about the journey that had brought them to this point. 5 years ago, she had been a general preparing for what might have been humanity's last war. Today, she was a statesman helping to build what might be the galaxy's first truly democratic government. Any regrets? Asked Admiral Okafor, joining her at the window as she had so many times before. About the war? No, Hayes replied without hesitation. We did what we had to do. But, I do wonder sometimes whether we could have found a way to achieve this transformation without so much bloodshed. Maybe, Okafor conceded. But, revolutions are rarely peaceful. The Council had 30,000 years to evolve into something more just and equitable. Instead, they became more entrenched in their authoritarianism. Sometimes change only comes when the old system becomes too painful to maintain. Hayes nodded, watching a group of ships from a dozen different species docking at the station's extended arms. The real test will be whether we can make this new system work. It's one thing to tear down an empire, and another thing entirely to build something better. You think we can do it? Hayes considered the question seriously. The challenges facing the Federation were enormous. Economic disparities between member worlds, cultural misunderstandings, territorial disputes left over from the Council era, and the constant threat that some charismatic leader would try to rebuild an empire from the fragments of the old order. But, then, she thought about the assembly session they had just completed, with representatives from hundreds of worlds working together to solve common problems. She thought about species that had been enemies for millennia learning to cooperate as equals. She thought about young people from across the galaxy who were growing up in a universe where freedom was the norm rather than the exception. "I think we have to try," she said finally. "The alternative is to accept that intelligent beings are incapable of governing themselves without resorting to domination and exploitation. And I refuse to accept that." Outside the observation window, the stars shone with the same light they had shed for billions of years, indifferent to the rise and fall of empires, the struggles of species, and the dreams of those who sought to build something better than what had come before. But, for the first time in 30,000 years, those stars shone on a galaxy where freedom was not something that had to be fought for and defended, but something that was acknowledged as the fundamental right of every intelligent being. The Council had expected payment in the form of submission and tribute. Humanity had delivered total war. And, from the ashes of that war had risen something that neither side had expected, a galaxy where the price of freedom was not constant vigilance against oppression, but the ongoing commitment to treat all beings with the dignity and respect that intelligence deserved. It wasn't perfect, and it would face countless challenges in the years to come. But it was theirs, built by their own choices rather than imposed by superior force. And that, Hayes reflected, made all the difference in the universe.